On cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and innovation will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on securing the .gov, examining efforts to strengthen federal network cybersecurity. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Before I begin with my opening remarks, I'd like to take a moment to express my most profound and sincere condolences to the family and friends of those who were so senselessly murdered in the mass shooting at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York over the weekend. For too long, hate-driven domestic terrorism has made the core of our communities, grocery stores, schools, places of worship unsafe. And we cannot tolerate that any longer. I'm pleased that both the Biden-Harris administration and this committee are confronting the threat posed by domestic extremists with such urgency and looking forward to those efforts. In December 2020, we learned that the Russian intelligence services has infiltrated the networks of multiple federal agencies by inserting malware in a SolarWinds software update. The Russians remained on federal networks undetected for months. This intrusion highlighted that the federal government's signature cybersecurity programs had failed to evolve, and adapt to meet the threats our nation faces today. Fortunately, over the past year and a half, we have seen a renewed focus in Congress and the executive branch on taking the necessary steps to bring our federal network security to where it must be. Immediately upon taking office in January, President Biden assembled a top-notch cybersecurity team that has brought together leading cybersecurity experts with decades' experience in both the public and private sector. The administration worked expeditiously, but methodically, to put together Executive Order 14028, which President Biden signed just over 1 year ago. This executive order represents a landmark effort to transform federal cybersecurity by modernizing federal agencies' cyber practices, strengthening supply chain security, and improving incident response and information sharing, among many other necessary enhancements. Security experts have hailed this executive order as a historic action to protect our federal government networks while using the federal government's purchasing power to lift the cybersecurity baseline for the private sector. Now that the initial deadlines set by the executive order have largely passed, the relevant agencies have had a year to implement its mandate. And I look forward to the discussion today on what has been achieved so far and what the strategy is for the continued implementation going forward. High-profile cyber incidents and the concerns of Russian cyber activity associated with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has made the importance of cybersecurity a front-page story. But this isn't the first time cybersecurity issues have captured headlines, and it isn't the first time Congress and the executive branch have committed to prioritizing cybersecurity and modernizing security policy. Historically, however, government focus has shifted after the headlines fade, and we have suffered the consequences. For example, in the aftermath of the 2015 OPM breach, Congress passed the Federal Cybersecurity Enhancement Act, which included mandates for agencies to implement multi-factor authentication and encryption, but not all agencies have complied. We must ensure that we do not lose focus and momentum this time. Fortunately, I'm confident that the Biden administration shares my commitment to ensuring we continue to accelerate our efforts to protect the federal networks. Today, I hope to hear more about how this subcommittee can partner with the administration to provide the necessary resources and authorities to continue the executive order's work. I also look forward to hearing more about how CISA has utilized the $650 million in funding Democrats in Congress included in the American Rescue Plan to strengthen our federal cybersecurity. I know our witnesses agree that it is a down payment on much needed sustained investment in federal cybersecurity, and we must continue to build on it by ensuring CISA has the necessary resources to modernize its national cybersecurity protection system and continue to mature its continuous diagnostic and mitigation program. Cybersecurity must be a priority for every single agency, but the ones represented here today have the expertise that other agencies may lack. Continuing to build out CISA's role as the operational lead for federal network security is a priority for me, and today's hearing will be an important opportunity to hear from the witnesses on how their agencies can better support the cybersecurity needs of the entire federal enterprise. I thank our witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to our discussion. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this critical conversation regarding the security of federal agency networks. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to a constructive dialogue. The SolarWinds breach of December 2020 was a wake-up call to the vulnerabilities that exist within the federal enterprise. Since then, we've uncovered the impact it had on 9 or more federal agencies and hundreds of other companies. We simply must do more to adapt government standards to not only meet but exceed adversarial capabilities like those of the Russian SolarWinds campaign. The federal government must also be a bold example for industry and set the bar high for enterprise network resilience. In order to secure federal networks, we must continue the nonpartisan tradition of addressing cybersecurity risks. The executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity provided timely guidance to federal entities on the diligence required to secure their networks. I was pleased to see the expertise of CISA fully leveraged throughout the EO and as the lead federal civilian cyber agency. CISA was importantly charged with developing a federal cloud security strategy, easing understanding of cyber incident reporting requirements, and working with federal partners like NIST to develop standards for critical software. I have long maintained that CISA is uniquely equipped to lead the federal government on cybersecurity measures, and I am pleased to see its potential recognized. The continued use of CISA's national critical functions as a guide will assist agencies in prioritizing assets and meeting the new security standards they are entrusted to maintain. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on their continued efforts to execute on the EO. Further, I hope to hear more about what Congress can do to support efforts to secure the nation's critical infrastructure at the federal level and across the private sector. I specifically look forward to hearing from the CIO of GSA, an agency that has done well in meeting the requirements of the EO. I hope that Mr. Shive can provide a valuable perspective to assist other agencies in improving their own cyber posture. I again thank the chairwoman for holding this important hearing, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and members are also reminded that the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd, 2021 colloquy regarding remote procedures. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. First, we'll hear from Mr. Christopher DeRusha, who serves as both the Federal Chief Administration Security Officer at the Office of Management and Budget and as the Deputy National Cyber Director for Federal Cybersecurity within the Office of the National Cyber Director. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Eric Goldstein back to the panel. Mr. Goldstein serves as the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at CISA, where he leads the Cybersecurity Division at CISA, which is responsible for carrying out CISA's programs to secure federal networks. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Charles Romine, the Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or Nist, which plays a vital role in developing the standards and security frameworks deployed across the federal enterprise. And finally, I look forward to hearing from Mr. David Shiv, the Chief Information Officer for the General Services Administration, or GSA, which plays a key role in the services and technologies used throughout the federal government. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask our witnesses to summarize their statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. DeRusha.
Chairman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this important hearing today to highlight the 1-year anniversary of Executive Order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity. I'm pleased to testify before you today with my colleagues from CISA, NIST, and GSA to discuss how the EO represents a true paradigm shift for federal cybersecurity, talk a little bit about why that shift is urgently needed, and review some of the successes that we feel we've had over the first year. The bottom line here is we can no longer rely on the outdated perimeter-based approach or digital walls that we've used to keep sophisticated actors from gaining unauthorized access to our systems. We really need to aggressively invest in making our systems more defensible by employing zero trust principles to better detect and contain our adversaries, replace ineffective deterrents like passwords with multi-factor authentication and encryption, continuously identify and remediate vulnerabilities, and transform our workplace culture by adopting a secure, aware mindset. This paradigm shift is really our best opportunity to change our adversaries' decision calculus and prevent harm. President Biden's executive order has set us on this path by aggressively and ambitiously shifting our cybersecurity strategy from an outdated mindset to one that is clear-eyed about our adversaries' capabilities and intent. The security of our nation will be drastically improved when the goals of the EO have been met, and we feel we've made tremendous progress over this first year. Through the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of National Cyber Director, we've issued a series of policies that carry forward the vision and actions laid out in the EO. In January of this year, OMB issued the Zero Trust Strategy, which directed agencies to invest in technology that's built and deployed with security at the forefront. This strategy sets out a common baseline of actions and investments to ensure a consistent approach across government, which will allow us to benchmark progress and share lessons among the agencies. Federal agencies have responded to this call of action and have provided their Zero Trust implementation plans spanning through fiscal year 2024. Second, recognizing that all government's vital services rely on software, as we learned in SolarWinds, OMB required agencies to comply with recent NIST guidance to protect critical software. Agencies are taking a phased approach to initially focus on standalone on-premise software that perform critical security functions. When this first phase is complete, we will ensure that government services function not only as intended, but also in a manner that is secure by design. Third, while the aforementioned policies make our systems more defensible, we do recognize that incidents may still occur. By enabling a continuously monitored government-wide endpoint detection and response system, we will improve our ability to quickly address malicious activity on federal systems. Finally, last August, OMB issued the first logging requirements for federal agencies. This information provides the digital fingerprints, which are critical to our system defenders' ability to detect, investigate, and remediate cyber incidents. These measures represent an extremely important step in the shift toward defensible systems. The vast majority of the actions called for in the EO, including these 4 that I've just highlighted, are now established policies and are being implemented. This illustrates the commitment that has been made across the entire federal enterprise to embracing the paradigm shift envisioned by the EO. Congress, and specifically this committee, have shown a very strong commitment to our government's cybersecurity. We appreciate the recent investment that was made in critical technology funds like the $1 billion appropriation to the Technology Modernization Fund, or TMF, which has already expanded our opportunities to address cybersecurity challenges. But this is just the beginning. We recognize that large-scale transformation does not happen in a year by launching new programs. It requires a commitment to cultural change, tireless implementation, and continued investment. This team sitting before you here, along with the dedicated cyber and IT professionals across the federal government, is committed. And together, we will tirelessly implement these initiatives. I look forward to partnering with you to demonstrate that in outcomes and the importance of sustained investment as we move forward together. So I thank you for the opportunity to testify here today, and I really look forward to your questions.
We thank you for your testimony, and I now recognize Mr. Goldstein to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, members of the subcommittee, it's a privilege to rejoin the group today and speak a bit about the role of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, in driving essential progress across the federal civilian executive branch. As we pass the 1-year anniversary of President Biden's issuance of the executive order on improving national cybersecurity, it's an opportune time to step back and reflect on the progress that CISA and our partners across the 101 federal civilian executive branch agencies have made in driving improvements in national cybersecurity, and the urgent work that we are driving going forward. As the nation's cyber defense agency and operational lead for civilian cybersecurity, CISA played an integral role in implementing the provisions of the executive order. But we've done so in close collaboration with our partners reflected on this witness table, CIOs and CISOs across the federal civilian executive branch, and our partners across the private sector and even the international community. I'm proud to report that CISA met each of our assigned efforts under the EO by the deadlines enumerated therein. But deadlines matter less than outcomes, and our focus needs to be on ensuring that the cybersecurity that we expect across federal civilian agencies is present across every department, every agency, every time. Our goal is simple: to reduce the prevalence and impact of cybersecurity intrusions targeting federal agencies, ensure that intrusions are detected more quickly, and that federal agencies are using modern secure technology that reduce the likelihood of intrusions by design. To appreciate the progress we've made, it's useful to step back and reflect on where we came from. As the committee well knows, the supply chain compromise perpetrated by malicious Russian cyber actors targeting, in many cases, SolarWinds devices was a call to action for the nation in cybersecurity and reflected a delta between the ability of our adversaries and our national cybersecurity posture. It also reflected, as my co-witness noted, the need for a new model. And the executive order is based directly on what we learned from the SolarWinds intrusion and our improvement plan to get to a better state. I'm looking forward during this hearing to talk a bit more about the urgent efforts that CISA is helping to drive to get us to this place where we will have less intrusions by design. This includes gaining centralized visibility across all federal civilian agencies by deployment of endpoint detection and response technologies, and by fully implementing our authorities to conduct persistent hunts across federal networks. It includes helping agencies more rapidly adopt zero trust principles, where networks are presumed to be untrusted, and we focus on securing the most important assets, accounts, and data by design. And I'm proud that CISA's zero trust maturity model, along with OMB's national zero trust strategy, are key accelerants for this effort. We're focused on advancing transparency and management of third-party cybersecurity risks, including by driving adoption of automated and interoperable software bill of materials that will give us a much more granular view into third-party risks affecting federal agencies and indeed across the nation. And expanding our provision of shared services and direct support to federal agencies to ensure that we reach a common baseline of maturity that we can reasonably expect to yield the cybersecurity outcomes that we expect. Our nation's at a turning point in cybersecurity. The executive order helped us make that turn and took important steps towards driving the change that we need to seek, but we have a tremendous amount of more work to do. In order to get where we need to be, we need continued focus and continued investment in both cybersecurity and IT modernization across the entire federal civilian executive branch. We deeply appreciate the support of Congress in getting us to this point, the focus of the Biden-Harris administration in driving needed change to achieving our shared goal of an environment where the American people's sensitive information and essential government services are rendered secure and resilient under all conditions. Thank you again for the chance to appear today. I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Romine to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm Charles Romine, the Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as Nist. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of Nist on efforts to improve the cybersecurity of the federal government. This year, Nist is celebrating its 50th anniversary of its work in cybersecurity. Nist's role in addressing cybersecurity and privacy challenges includes conducting research and developing broad and foundational standards, guidelines, and tools for public and non-public organizations. The collaborative, transparent, and open processes that Nist uses to develop these resources results in more effective and usable resources that are widely trusted and therefore more widely used. Technology standards and the foundational research that enables their development and use are critical to advancing trust in digital products and services. They can provide increased assurance, thus enabling more secure, private, and rights-preserving technologies. With growing cybersecurity risks and rapid advances in technology, advancing trust in technology could not be more important. Federal agencies rely on Nist to provide unbiased, technically sound information that is both actionable and flexible to manage cybersecurity risks within their unique missions. NIST standards and guidelines provide a baseline and how-to direction for federal agencies in developing and managing their cybersecurity and privacy programs. NIST's work also informs OMB and CISA in their roles to help federal agencies operationalize these strong cybersecurity measures. I'm pleased to testify today with my fellow panelists from OMB, from CISA, and from GSA, all critical partners with NIST in enhancing federal cybersecurity. The executive order improving the nation's cybersecurity was critically aimed at improving the cybersecurity of federal government and the nation. Many recent incidents share commonalities, including insufficient software and supply chain cybersecurity defenses that leave organizations vulnerable to incidents. In response to the EO, over the last year, NIST published groundbreaking work to enhance software supply chain security. The guidance developed by NIST is aimed at securing existing software already in use by federal agencies, as well as adopting strong, secure software development and supply chain risk management principles to address the security of software procured by federal agencies. NIST is committed to working within the executive branch to assist OMB and agencies in implementing these practices. The executive order also directed federal agencies to adopt zero-trust architectures based off NIST guidelines, moving toward a new paradigm for cybersecurity, as you have been told. As agencies work to implement the guidance under the executive order, it's important to continue to implement the full complement of our guidance to manage risks. Along these lines, NIST has kicked off a process to update the NIST cybersecurity framework, widely used across public and private sectors, to make it easier for organizations to manage growing cybersecurity risks. Emerging technologies, such as Internet of Things, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence, will add additional challenges for federal cybersecurity. More than ever, federal agencies and other organizations must balance a rapidly evolving threat landscape against the need to fulfill mission requirements. Cybersecurity must be considered alongside all other types of risks addressed by organizations and by leadership at the most senior level. Nist is committed to ensuring that organizations have the guidance and the tools they need to do so. Thank you for the opportunity to present on Nist activities to improve federal network cybersecurity through implementation of Executive Order 14028, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank you for your testimony here today. And finally, let me apologize and recognize Mr. Shive to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark, Ranking Member Garbarino, and members of the subcommittee. My name is David Shive, and I am the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. General Services Administration. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the important role and impact of federal network security and the role that plays for GSA and the larger federal government. The executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity has laid out a clear vision for cybersecurity through a targeted focus on improving the federal government's ability to identify, deter, protect, detect, and respond. The executive order is wide-ranging and outlines the standards and requirements that federal organizations will take to ensure cyber resiliency. Among the numerous key activities is the adoption of zero trust. At GSA, we have transformed our cybersecurity strategy to a zero trust strategy that aligns with the administration's goals. We have worked collaboratively in partnership with our colleagues at the Office of Management and Budget, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the Office of the National Cyber Director, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology to leverage best practices in the sharing of information. Zero trust is not a panacea. It is not a singular solution either. Zero trust presents an opportunity for an important pivot that requires a multi-year approach and sustained financial investment that builds on the existing cybersecurity principles of least privilege and layered defense, made possible by advances in technology that make it more readily achievable today. For the past few years, GSA has been working to modernize technology to protect against cyber threats and deliver a better digital experience for the American people. We are committed to realizing the promise of these innovations in the most simple and secure way possible, balancing cybersecurity with customer experience. My organization has been working to enhance the security of our underlying systems, making available more secure authentication options, moving beyond simple user IDs and passwords to uniquely log into systems. We have implemented rigorous cybersecurity and privacy requirements, independent assessment and authorization, and ongoing security monitoring. We have also focused on encryption to ensure our information is secure in transit from web browsers to sites and in the back-end databases where our data is stored. We are evolving from the traditional perimeter-based, compliance-oriented model to a zero-trust architecture that considers resources as fundamentally untrusted. With zero trust, we seek to verify everything and anything attempting access and verify that access continually. In 2021, GSA received $29.8 million investments from the Technology Modernization Fund to modernize legacy network systems and advance our zero trust architecture strategy. We are focusing that funding on three zero trust building blocks: users and devices, networks, and enhanced security operations center capabilities, expanding it to also cover our government-wide shared services like data.gov, cloud.gov, login.gov, and max.gov. We are also accelerating our adoption of secure cloud services, leveraging modern cloud services to improve cybersecurity and user experience. We continue to support the FedRAMP program, which provides a standardized approach to security authorizations for cloud authorizations. By implementing these modernization efforts, GSA will improve cybersecurity capabilities to continually verify the security of users, devices, applications, and data, as well as to achieve broad-based visibility across the GSA ecosystem with enhanced capabilities leveraging automation to manage and respond to threats in real time. GSA will also improve user experience through seamless connection to GSA-managed environments and applications while maintaining zero trust principles. The security of federal systems is paramount. This is truer today than at any time before. We are at an age where an increasingly connected and where the cybersecurity threat landscape is heightened. As a nation, we face persistent and increasingly sophisticated malicious cyber campaigns that threaten all of us, the public sector, the private sector, and the security and privacy of the American people. These threats have evolved from basic hacking and denial of service operations seeking to disrupt mission delivery to more sophisticated nation-state sponsored threats targeting critical infrastructure that seek to use cyber as an asymmetric tool of broader warfare. All organizations can be vulnerable if they do not take appropriate steps to plan for and avoid cyber attack. We have no choice but to evolve. As the last few years have shown, traditional approaches to cyber and network defense are no longer commensurate with the threats we face as a government. We need to raise the security bar, integrating zero trust concepts into everything we do in IT, security, and assurance levels, which also necessarily includes sustained funding. Thanks for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss federal information security and its important role in the government. I look forward to answering any questions you have.
And I thank the witnesses for your testimony here today. I'll remind the subcommittee that we all each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has highlighted the serious cyber threats we face. In particular, during this period of geopolitical conflict, interest from foreign adversaries in accessing our federal agency networks is likely to be as high as ever. Mr. DeRusha and Mr. Goldstein, what actions has the administration taken to secure federal agencies in response to the threat from Russia in recent months?
Well, thank you, Chairman, for the question. We share your concern. That's why we've been convening federal CIOs and CISOs for conversations around elevated threat levels and preparation measures since last November. And it's something that we've really sustained over that period of time with regular communication. I give a lot of kudos to DHS, both the headquarters standing up a unified coordination group to really be proactively prepared for anything that could come our way. And also just the measures that CIS has taken in their Shields Up effort, a lot of fantastic resources. Anytime they see something occurring in Ukraine or elsewhere, they're sharing that information with the entire federal CIO and CISO community, ensuring that they have that threat information at their fingertips to prevent any harm that could come our way. So, it's something that we take seriously. We remain in an elevated state, and I kind of offer Eric for further comments on that.
Certainly. Thank you so much. As noted by my co-witness, this has been our paramount concern even well before Russia's tragic invasion of Ukraine in February. As the operational lead for federal cybersecurity, our focus at CISA has been on taking any information that we can glean from our partners in the private sector, from our partners operating on the ground in Ukraine, computer emergency response teams in Eastern Europe, taking that information, distilling it down, and then sharing it as quickly as possible with our key partners here in the US, including particularly federal civilian executive branch agencies. We have done that work through our published advisories, all of which are available at our centralized website at cisa.gov/shieldsup, as well as through our focused engagements with federal agencies and partners like OMB and ONCD to ensure that even though we have not yet seen the damaging attacks on the homeland that we were so concerned about, we remain in this posture of heightened risk and focus on sharing information as quickly as possible so we can stay ready if those attacks begin to manifest.
Fully implementing Executive Order 14028 will take time and resources, but with other adversaries constantly working to breach federal networks, it is necessary, it is essential that we make progress to shore up our defenses now. For all of the witnesses, now that it has been a year since the executive order was signed, how are federal networks more secure today than they were 1 year ago? And we'll start with you, Mr. DeRusha. Absolutely.
So in the executive order, we took on both root cause issues, which will take longer to fully address, contract clauses, real kind of deeper barriers. But we also made significant progress on some security measures that have immediate impact, like multi-factor authentication, encryption at rest and transit. We picked a few of these measures that have most impact and have put the highest amount of priority you could have around them, metricing them, having engagements with not just CIOs and CISOs, but senior agency leadership, multiple meetings with deputy secretaries, tracking, measuring progress, learning about their barriers to success, how we can support and work through those. So, and also just starting on the path of zero trust implementation. Agencies have not been sitting still in that. Far from it. They started moving right away, reprioritizing resources and investments. So, we've got a lot of work ahead, but I really feel very, very good about the progress we're making and the path we put ourselves on.
Mr. Goldstein?
Building on the points from my co-witness, if we look from the point of view of CISA as the operational lead on the big gaps that we tried to address with the executive order subsequent to the SolarWinds intrusion, we're making tremendous progress across each of them. We are gaining extraordinary centralized visibility into threats and risks targeting federal agencies through expansion of our endpoint detection and response capabilities, through maturation of our continuous diagnostics and CDM program, a mitigation program or CDM, including by bringing online a new CDM dashboard that provides never before available visibility into agency risks. We're also rolling out new cybersecurity shared services, increasing our direct support to federal agencies so they can more effectively meet CISA's directives and OMB guidance. And we're working as part of the broader interagency as we push this paradigm shift towards zero trust principles, including by providing not only guidance, but also hands-on support to help agencies make this transition. So as my co-witness noted, this is going to be a journey. We have significant work to do, but with support of Congress, we're certainly well on our way.
Gentlemen, my time has expired, but I'm going to circle back to you. Keep that question in mind. Having said that, I now yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Garbarino.
Thank you, Chairwoman. First, I want to start with Mr. Shive. In your testimony, you really talked about what GSA had done, how it met the requirements under the EO. Can you please share some of your lessons learned from meeting those requirements that could be shared with less cyber mature federal agencies to help them catch up?
Yes, thank you for the question. There's a few things that agencies can and should do. I'll use GSA as the example. One, make sure that cybersecurity is baked into every business plan that you develop. Cybersecurity done in isolation typically yields pretty poor results. Number two, make sure you're attracting top-notch talent. And that's a difficult play here in the federal government, but an important play. Make sure you have the right cyber defenders. Number three, make sure that deep and meaningful partnerships are in place so that you can gain the value of the larger cyber defense community. A cyber shop that tries to implement the tenets of the cyber executive order in isolation does so at their own peril. But if they leverage the value of the larger community, the expertise of the larger community, working with Nist, working with CISA, working with others, they'll be able to accelerate the adoption of the tenets within cybersecurity. And then the last thing is just get started. It doesn't matter if you have to repurpose funds, if you have to repurpose investment dollars. Treat this with the importance that it deserves.
I appreciate that answer, specifically since you talked about how both every federal agency has a unique mission, but they all face similar challenges when it comes to cyber, and it doesn't just and it's cyber, but also with limited resources allocated to defend against these unlimited cyber attacks. So, how has GSA managed to be successful with these constrained resources, and how could the federal government be more successful in this regard?
Right. So the GSA experience, I should be clear. We started implementing the tenets of the Cyber EO before the Cyber EO was even a thing. When you look at the basic tenets of Cyber EO, good encryption and supply chain risk management and stuff, these are just good cybersecurity practices. And we as an agency recognize the value of many of these tenets before it was codified in an executive order and started to move out in our pilots and MVPs to assess whether or not the theories that are baked into the EO were the things that we should be making investments in time and people. Another key enabler for the GSA experience is we've had a succession of front offices that have seen cybersecurity as a key enabler to 21st century business, and especially 21st century government business. So we had an early and head start on trying to tackle this big, hairy problem. The third is we've invested tons of time and energy into attracting top-notch talent. We have a difficult challenge there. We don't pay the same that the private sector does, but we can appeal to public service because that is an important mission space and attract top-notch cyber defenders into the organization.
I appreciate that answer. I'm going to switch over to Mr. Goldstein. Specific question, given the continued risks associated with the .gov, how do you balance CISA's emphasis on supporting national critical functions through the private sector with the work still to be done within the federal agencies?
Thank you for that question, sir. And actually, you framed it very well in your opening remarks. Across the breadth of our cybersecurity mission, we have to take a risk and consequence-based approach and also be driven by our understanding of the adversary. What are adversaries targeting, and what are the impacts of a potential intrusion? The National Critical Functions, or NCF, provides us a model that generalizes across the private sector and federal agencies. And of course, we know that federal agencies provide essential services and store sensitive data that underpin many national critical functions, really across the breadth of our federal government. Within the U.S. government, we have a program focusing on high-value assets, which really is the application of the national critical functions principles to the services and systems managed by federal agencies. And so at CISA, by taking this prioritization approach and applying it across our national stakeholder base, that allows us to direct resources, information, and guidance towards what's going to have the greatest effect in driving down the most important cybersecurity risks to the American people.
I appreciate that answer. I had a follow-up, but I ran out of time, so I'll yield back to the chairwoman.
The chair will now recognize other members for questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. In accordance with the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy, I will recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority. Members are also reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questioning. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today and the outstanding work that you are doing to protect our nation in cyberspace. Let me begin with Mr. Goldstein, if I could. Mr. Goldstein, CISA is currently charged with implementing a centrally located endpoint detection and response initiative across the federal government. This responsibility becomes increasingly important as the federal government migrates to a zero trust architecture and the need for greater visibility and security of federal devices and other endpoints become even more critical. So in your testimony, you mentioned that more than 15 agencies now have endpoint detection and response capabilities. Can you tell me what the holdup is with the other agencies, why they are not as mature or along the way in having this endpoint detection and response capabilities yet? And what resources can Congress provide to accelerate CISA's work with the rest of the federal civilian executive branch to procure and implement endpoint detection and response solutions?
Congressman, thank you for that question. And as ever, thank you for your support of our national cybersecurity and CISA in particular. Our program to deploy endpoint detection and response capabilities across the federal government is a great example of Congress and the administration working in concert towards a common end. Resources provided by Congress in the American Rescue Plan Act have been foundational in catalyzing deployment of these necessary tools across federal agencies. And President Biden's cybersecurity executive order took needed steps like requiring agencies to update legal agreements that accelerated our access at CISA to necessary endpoint data. At this point, we are in the process of deploying these EDR tools across 26 federal civilian agencies and expect to be underway at 53 agencies by the end of this fiscal year, only a few short months away, which means that not even a year and a half after execution of the executive order, we will have EDR deployments in place or underway at over half of the federal government, with more rolling out in the months to come. We have seen great uptake across federal civilian agencies, but the work needs to continue. And we look forward to working with Congress on annualizing investments under the American Rescue Plan Act as part of the fiscal year 23 president's budget, so we can ensure that this work continues in the months to come.
Thank you. And so to be clear, no specific ask of Congress right now to help accelerate things?
That's correct, sir. The most important thing that we can do together is ensure that we have the resources as codified in the FY23 president's budget so we can keep advancing these deployments into the next fiscal year.
Thank you. Then for both Mr. Goldstein or Mr. DeRusha, as I mentioned, increasing our visibility of federal endpoints is one component of the broader strategy for transition federal agencies to a zero trust model of network security. OMB guidance issued earlier this year lays out numerous objectives that agencies must complete in that effort. Mr. DeRusha or Mr. Goldstein, what metrics will your agencies be using to document and track agency adoption of these objectives?
Yeah, absolutely, Congressman. So in the Zero Trust strategy, we really laid out an ambitious agenda. We followed CISA's capability and maturity model and put out actions and objectives across identity, devices, network, applications, and data. And we set key specific targets, many of which we put specific deadlines on, so we're going to be tracking those as one success metric. But we also asked agencies to provide us with specific tailored implementation plans, and we've received those now. We're going through them with a cross-agency review team, including CISA, ONCD, OMB, to really make sure that they're solid plans, that they're achievable, and they have the right investment requests behind them. And so that's how we're going to track progress. We're going to get specific with each of these agencies and hold them accountable to those plans over multi-year.
Thank you. And before my time expires, Mr. Goldstein, last fall, CISA issued binding operational directive 2201, creating new requirements for federal civilian agencies to patch known exploited vulnerabilities within a specified timeline. How would you assess agency compliance with patching timelines, as CISA had added new entries to the known exploited vulnerabilities database?
Madam Chairman, may I answer? Thank you. Binding Operational Directive 2201, which for the first time directed federal agencies to mitigate vulnerabilities that we know to be actively exploited by adversaries in the real world, has been an extraordinary success story. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, across the federal civilian executive branch, we are tracking mitigation of hundreds of thousands of vulnerable instances. These are individual pieces of software or products with vulnerabilities that we know are being exploited in the wild. We have seen extraordinary work to mitigate these vulnerabilities. At the same time, we've also identified that there's actually a small number of vulnerabilities that account for the preponderance of unmitigated vulnerabilities, what we call residual risk, across the federal civilian executive branch, therefore allowing agencies to prioritize their resources to most effect. But I'll also add that this directive has sent an extraordinary signal across the broader country. And we hear from companies big and small across sectors who use our catalog of these vulnerabilities to prioritize their own mitigation efforts, thereby really reducing the attack surface that our adversaries are able to exploit, not just in government, but across the country as a whole.
Very good. Thank the witnesses, and thank you, Madam Chair, for the indulgence of the time. Thank you. I yield back.
Absolutely. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Mrs. Harshbarger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for coming today to testify about protecting our federal networks. You know, I read an article last month in Simpre. That is a technology company that reviews American infrastructure. They released a study finding that certain commercial smartphones could resist an electromagnetic pulse or an EMP caused by the detonation of a nuclear device. And I guess this question is for Mr. Goldstein. It's 3 parts. How is CISA evaluating the emergence of commercial EMP survivability? The second part is how quickly is CISA able to scale commercial EMP survivability to harden and enable the national network against EMPs? And the third part of the question is, what does CISA need to do to prepare for a potential response?
Great. Thank you for that question, ma'am. At CISA, we are certainly concerned about a range of risks, natural or human caused, that could degrade our critical infrastructure and national critical functions. Within CISA, our National Risk Management Center, or NRMC, is deeply focused on understanding how EMP risks could manifest to affect our national critical functions, and then understanding how critical infrastructure can adopt measures in place to reduce the likelihood of those risks occurring. As part of that work, we work closely both with owners and operators of infrastructure that could be impacted, as well as with vendors of solutions that may provide technology that could be available as solutions. That work continues, and certainly as the state of the art to understand both the potential for and impacts of EMP risks evolve, we will keep working with the broader technology community to ensure that the right safeguards are in place to mitigate that risk to critical infrastructure across the country.
Well, Mr. Goldstein, were you aware that they had tested that particular technology and they found 2 different phone systems that could take an EMP strike?
Ma'am, I'm not aware of that particular report.
Okay. Without objection, I'd like to submit the article to the record, Madam Chair.
Certainly, without
Okay.
objection.
Okay. Well, there were 2 different phones that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. These phones were found the tested models include the Apple iPhone 12 and the Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra 5G. And the whole point is to keep these telecommunications survivable. And if you already have a starting point, you don't have to go too far to figure out that you can start there and go forward with trying to find something and educate the public about this, not only the government, but the public. But and that begs the second part of that question is how quickly can we scale this up to harden and enable a national network against EMPs, and what do we need to do to prepare? I guess I have a follow-up question for the whole panel, and anyone can jump in. Could you elaborate on any interagency collaboration you've had in preparation with the evolving EMP threat? And that's for anybody to answer.
Certainly, ma'am. I'll offer the risk of EMPs remains a very active issue across the federal government, relating both to our national communication systems and our federal agencies. And certainly this is an area where CISA, in our role in safeguarding critical infrastructure, has a role to play, but we certainly depend on the expertise of colleagues across the federal government and indeed the private sector to ensure that we are understanding the risk as it may evolve and solutions that may be adoptable or scalable in the future.
Anybody else want to elaborate on that? Well, we know that there was a commission created by Congress, and it existed for a number of years, and they produced many detailed reports. Maybe we need to go back and reread those EMP commission reports going forward and put a little more emphasis on that particular entity as far as what's going on and what the U.S. government can do to protect us from that. And I guess with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee.
I thank the chair and I thank you for this very important hearing. And I witnesses as well. Let me begin quickly. The U.S. has a limited number of incident response and investigative teams capable of responding to an attack as sophisticated as solar winds. In the absence of investigators and incident responders, many organizers are flying blind, many organizations. Is the United States government and CISA in particular able to triage support to the nation's most vital, regionally or nationally significant assets, maybe such as airports or electric grids? And then secondarily, how confident are you that the most significant assets and systems in the U.S. understand the exposure to threats arising from the SolarWinds campaign? Any witness can answer that?
Certainly, thank you, ma'am. Both great questions. On the first, we are deeply conscious of the potential for a widespread cybersecurity intrusion campaign that would stretch the resources of CISA and the broader cybersecurity community, pardon me, to respond and recover. Congress was very thoughtful in anticipating this risk and passing the Cyber Response and Recovery Act, which included funding for the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund that allows CISA to fund, for example, private incident responders to support victims of intrusions where the U.S. government's resources may be exhausted. Now, within the U.S. government, CISA works closely across our partners, including the Defense Department and the U.S. Coast Guard, for example, to ensure that we have resources to respond when asked. But with resources like the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund, we're also able to leverage the resources of the private sector to meet demand if our resources are exceeded. On the second question, ma'am, one of our most important efforts at CISA as part of the broader government community is make sure that we are communicating with organizations big and small about their exposure to cyber risks like the SolarWinds campaign. Many larger and more mature organizations certainly understand that risk, but we're conscious that, for example, small local governments, small and medium businesses may still not understand that risk. That's why at CISA, we have regional cybersecurity personnel deployed across every state in the country who every day are knocking on doors, physical and virtual, to make sure that organizations understand their unique cybersecurity risk and take urgent actions in response.
Let me pursue that, and I have two questions that I have to get answered quickly. One of them is that we know that incident response teams were overwhelmed before the SolarWinds campaign by ransomware, business email compromises, and other traditional type of cyber attacks. Is there any way to get our hands around those traditional attack vectors like ransomware to free up our overall incident response capacity?
Absolutely.
Let's take that.
Yep, absolutely. One of the ways that we need to achieve that goal, making sure that we have the capacity to respond and recover, is in part by meeting the National Cyber Workforce Challenge. The more that we can train individuals and organizations, for example, individuals at municipal governments, individuals at small and medium businesses, to have some ability to do initial analysis and triage, and then help organizations understand what are the steps that they should take in the minutes after an intrusion occurs, that can have a real impact in minimizing the consequences of a cyber intrusion. And so at the end of the day, there's a capacity challenge here that we can work through funding and resources, but there's also an education and awareness challenge, making sure that every entity in the country has the skilled and trained workforce that they need and that reflects the diversity of this country to meet an incident if one occurs.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Congresswoman, I think you went on mute. Unmute.
Not intentionally, sorry. I don't know how that occurred. Let me quickly say to Mr. LaRussa, are you satisfied with the federal government's level of insight about the extent to which U.S. critical infrastructure has been infiltrated during this campaign, and that's the SolarWinds? And in your opinion, is there anything that could have been improved and if critical infrastructure entities were required to report major cybersecurity incidents, for instance, the CISA, would that create better situational awareness? You could sort of summarize those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. DeRusso?
It is absolutely the case that more cyber incident reporting provides CISA and our partners with essential information to help victims and help other potential victims before incidents happen. That is why we're so grateful for Congress in passing the Cyber Incident and Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act. Recently, we look forward to a transparent process to put those rules in effect that will require cyber incident reporting to CISA, and that is information that will be foundational to gain visibility into national cybersecurity risks and drive urgent action to reduce those risks wherever they manifest.
Thank you.
The gentleman's
have an answer?
time has expired.
Yield back.
The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark and Ranking Member Garbarino, for holding this important hearing focused on our nation's cybersecurity. In light of the increased number of cyber attacks in recent years, and especially considering Russia's malign cyber activities, I think it's more important than ever that the United States be proactive in advancing our nation's cybersecurity. I'd also like to thank each of you for being here, and I'm glad for the work of your agencies to develop standardized responses, consistent terminology, and modernized approaches to strengthen our defenses and protect the United States from bad actors in cyberspace. Last week, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform held a markup in which we reviewed legislation aimed at transitioning to a post-quantum computing cybersecurity system. And while this particular legislation was brought up without knowing the associated cost, and I think associated cost is pretty important, I'm interested to learn more about U.S. preparations for a post-quantum computing scenario. So, Dr. Rahman, you briefly mentioned quantum computing in your testimony, so this question is coming your way, sir. From my understanding, Nist is currently developing post-quantum cryptography standards and selecting quantum-resistant cryptography algorithms. Can you please briefly explain the United States' current defensive posture, like where we are right now in the event of a large-scale quantum computer? That if a large-scale quantum computer is built and employed against us by an adversary, where do we stand, sir?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I really appreciate it. Nist has been working for a number of years now with the private sector, with cryptographic experts around the world to identify the algorithms that will be resistant to quantum attack, but also resistant to classical attack. We can't forget that we can't put our defenses down. So we're excited that we are able to leverage, hundreds and hundreds of cryptographers around the world and the talents associated, as well as those in our federal workforce, including those at Nist. The expectation is that a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, which is one of a sufficient size to crack our current, most of our current infrastructure, is still a number of years away, and that's some solace, but we cannot be complacent. We have to move fast, which is why we started a number of years ago to do this analysis. And I'm excited to tell you that we are nearing the finish line for the identification of multiple algorithms that we judge to be sufficiently strong to withstand a cryptographic attack from a quantum computer.
Thank you. That's good to hear. Look forward to hearing more about that. I'm going to transition to a different topic. I think this question's for you, Mr. DeRusso. Will CISA have any role with, will your agency have any role with or relationship to the Homeland Security Disinformation Governance Board? This is a board that was created within DHS, and it has caused great concern with respect to First Amendment rights, and I think rightfully so.
Congressman, the Office of Management Budget is not currently involved in that.
Okay, all right. So, Mr. Goldstein, this one's for you. I would be remiss, as many times as we've seen each other, if I didn't ask you a similar question. So, will CISA have any role with or relationship to the Homeland Security Disinformation Governance Board?
Thank you, sir. The board that you mentioned is a DHS body. Respectfully, sir, I'll defer questions on the board back to the department.
Okay. The Disinformation Governance Board is a prime example, in my opinion, of big government socialism overreach. And so you're saying that CISA will not have any connection to whatsoever with the Disinformation Governance Board?
So respectfully, I'll defer questions back to the department.
Well, I'm asking about CISA.
Sir, CISA shares this committee's concern about malicious foreign influence targeting critical infrastructure, including U.S. elections. CISA's role in that particular space is to promote national resilience through collaboration and partnerships. I'll defer questions on the reference board back to our department.
All right, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Goldstein, as the Biden administration works to secure federal networks and shift our cyber posture from reactive to proactive, it's focused on developing capabilities for continuously monitoring threats and providing real-time visibility into vulnerabilities. To that end, the administration has emphasized continuous diagnostic and mitigation capabilities to give threat hunters greater visibility into agency networks. And the administration's executive order directed agencies to update their memorandum of agreement with CISA to ensure object-level data is shared with CISA. I'd ask you, Mr. Goldstein, if agencies have updated their agreements with CISA, and has CISA received data necessary to gain this critical visibility in federal networks?
Thank you, ma'am. It's a wonderful question. I'm very glad to report that every agency has updated their relevant memorandum of agreement with CISA to provide us with, as you noted correctly, object-level data through our continuous diagnostic and mitigation dashboards. And we are now able to access that necessary data, which is so critical for us to understand the prevalence of vulnerabilities and other risk conditions across federal agencies and drive much more targeted and faster mitigation of risk that may emerge.
So then you would also, so you're confirming that, you mentioned the CDM dashboard. To what extent are federal agencies connected?
We are in the process of a rather remarkable technology improvement across the federal dashboard, which is giving us this object-level data. We are getting more agencies onboarded at this point every week. Nearly all large agencies, what we call the CFO Act agencies, are now connected, and we are getting these smaller and medium agencies connected up as each week goes by. And this really is the first time that CISA and federal agencies have had this level of visibility, and we are really excited for how we can use it both operationally and also, to one of the prior questions, to support our colleagues in OMB and the Office of the National Cyber Director in understanding and measuring federal cybersecurity risk.
So you haven't been met with any resistance, I would ask. It sounds like you have not.
We have not. I think agencies have really see the value in this visibility. Importantly here, although CISA gets the visibility we need, federal CIOs and CISOs, like my co-witness on this panel, also benefit from this same visibility. And so there are really enterprise gains to be had for agencies as well as for CISA in our cross-governmental role.
So, as you know, Congress provided the CDM program with a significant funding increase in the FY 2022 omnibus to address specifically the mobile device threat landscape across federal civilian agencies. Mr. Goldstein, can you give us a sense of how CISA plans to put this funding to use to ramp up mobile device security?
Absolutely, and this is really a key evolution for the CDM program, which historically was really focused on the workstations and servers sitting at federal agencies. But of course, we know in this new hybrid, even remote first universe in which we're living in, a lot of federal employees are really using their mobile devices for a significant volume of agency work and processing important information. So we are in the process now of integrating new mobile asset management capabilities into the CDM program and expect to make significant progress on getting the breadth of federal agencies onboarded to those key tools by the end of this fiscal year.
So just to follow up on a question that Mr. Langevin had regarding the EDR technology, is CISA focused on deployment, deploying EDR technology on federal workers' mobile devices, or is that rollout still focused more on the traditional endpoints you mentioned, like laptops, desktops, servers, and the like?
Principally, our current deployment of EDR functions focuses on agency workstations and servers based upon our understanding of the adversary threat model. And that's also what's going to allow us to fully implement our authorities to conduct persistent hunts across federal networks. If we look back to the SolarWinds intrusion, one of the lessons learned was the need to correlate, for example, threat activity that we might see at the perimeter of a federal agency to something happening at a workstation to something happening in the cloud. This EDR visibility is really foundational to giving us our ability to connect those dots and detect intrusions far more quickly.
Thank you very much to all the witnesses, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. LaTurna.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My first question is for Mr. Romine. Mr. Romine, can you briefly discuss how you are involved in setting information technology standards to enable national priorities, especially related to cybersecurity?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. By statute, Nist has the responsibility to develop guidelines and standards documents for the purpose of securing federal networks. We provide those tools to operational entities across the federal government for their use in managing their own cybersecurity risk, cybersecurity and privacy risk. The way that we do that is through a engagement with the public and private sector. We do that through an open and transparent process that ultimately garners the best technical expertise in cybersecurity across all aspects of society, and we bring that information together and ultimately evolve these documents, these tools, as a means of providing the necessary mechanisms for agencies to improve or establish cybersecurity and privacy programs.
Do you think, you talked about the transparent process, do you think that you have the level of participation that you need?
Thank you for the question. We do, because Nist, as a non-regulatory agency, we have cultivated the trust of the private sector, the public sector. We have no hidden agenda. Our goal is specifically to get the very best technical standards developed, and for that reason, we get very active participation across many different sectors, across cybersecurity expertise, privacy experts, civil society. We get input from a very large set of stakeholders, and for that reason, we feel that it's a very effective mechanism to develop standards and guidelines for cybersecurity.
Thank you. Mr. Shive, can you speak to how you collaborate with other federal agencies? How are you interacting with your CIO peers to improve everyone's understanding of the threat landscape?
So we have both formal and informal collaboration mechanisms. An example is the Federal CIO Council. We meet twice a month to talk about these specific issues: cybersecurity, technology modernization, the plays necessary to transform technology use and secure technology in the federal government. There are also informal connections as well. The CIO community is a fraternity of people who are all trying to solve many of the same problems. And they realize even though our business missions are quite different, many of the cybersecurity challenges are similar throughout the federal government. So we spend a fair amount of time talking amongst each other about how we're solving specific and direct problems. And I'll give you an example. Dr. Romine's team sets standards for cybersecurity that the federal government follows. They have been very good over the last few years. Instead of only reaching out to industry and academia and research entities to help define and derive their standards that then the federal government employs, they've been very good about reaching out to the CIO community to take a look at the practical cybersecurity practice that's taking place in the field and allowing that to inform standards. So standards are not just academic, they're based on what's actually being seen on the ground. Those type of informal collaborations derive as much value as those formal collaborations you see in places like the Federal CIO Council.
I appreciate that, and I'll stick with you. What other areas should OECD, CISA, and Congress focus on to continue to be successful and improve our nation's cybersecurity posture in the face of ever-evolving, increasingly sophisticated cyber threats?
Great question. Thank you for asking that. Two main things jump to mind. The first is, as you consider the business mission of the federal government, consider cybersecurity as an integral part of that. So as you're making investment and appropriations decisions on how this government should run, be thinking about cybersecurity and the implications to that. The other is the cybersecurity play is a multi-year play, and the government is not often funded in a multi-year strategy, but we as a community, the legislative and executive branch, need to analyze the risk on a multi-year strategy, make investments in time and people and money in a multi-year strategy. That would be a big game changer for us.
Thank you for your answer. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the vice chair of the committee, a gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the wake of SolarWinds, President Biden issued Executive Order 14028, requiring all agencies to either implement multi-factor authentication by November or provide a reason for failing to do so. In January, Chair Clark and I sent a letter seeking an update on the full extent of agency compliance with the MFA mandate. Director Easterly replied, despite the November deadline set by the President, only 13 federal agencies and 1 CFO agency reported compliance with the MFA mandate. In the same letter, Director Easterly promised us that almost all agencies that could implement MFA would do so by mid-March. So my first question to Mr. Goldstein, has that promise been kept?
Thank you for that question, sir. The executive order, as you note, drove extraordinary progress in foundational security controls, including MFA and encryption. We have seen agencies invest significant amounts and make significant progress in deploying MFA wherever possible and encrypting data both in transit and at rest. Now, we know that given the significant breadth of legacy, outdated IT infrastructure across federal agencies, at times deploying modern security controls can be challenging.
Sure, but I just want to interject. But when Director Easterly replied to our letter, she certainly was aware of the obsolescence of technology. And even then, she said that almost all the agencies with the capacity to implement MFA would do so by mid-March. So has that promise been kept? It's either yes or no.
Yes, sir. So I would say every agency with the capacity to deploy MFA and encryption has done so in almost all cases. I'm very glad to take a question for the record and provide further data on the progress across agencies towards that goal.
Do you have a number?
I don't.
The number of agencies?
I don't, sir.
Okay. The President's executive order founded the Cyber Safety Review Board for the purpose of conducting a review of the SolarWinds compromise. To Mr. Goldstein or Mr. DeRusha, has the Cyber Safety Review Board undertaken a review of the SolarWinds breach?
So I'll answer that as actually a board member. So the board has taken on its first review, and that is absolutely a piece of the focus in the board's review. However, we're also focused on the Log4j vulnerability event and ensuring that we're learning critical lessons from that event because of its drastic impact.
So you have conducted a review of SolarWinds?
So that is part of the Cyber Safety Review Board's first review.
Okay. So, and what's the timeline for the completion of the review?
So the board's report is due to the Secretary of Homeland Security at the end of May, and then there's a 30-day period for review by the Secretary for submission to the President after that.
The SolarWinds breach revealed the inadequacies of the Einstein program, which, as I understand it, lacks the capacity to detect anomalous network behaviors. Mr. Goldstein, what is the timeline for modernizing Einstein and equipping it with the capacity to detect novel threats?
Thank you for that question, sir. Modernization of Einstein is underway now. Our philosophy to secure the federal civilian executive branch and make dramatic progress towards detecting previously unknown or unseen threats is to move beyond the perimeter or network focus of the legacy Einstein system and focus really in three areas. First, getting visibility into the endpoint level, the servers and workstations where agencies do their work. As noted previously, that work is well underway with more than half of agencies to be progressing by the end of the year. Second, to gain visibility into cloud environments through the ability to hunt through and aggregate logs. And then third, to your question, sir, modernizing the perimeter defenses that we deploy, including by moving more towards commercial shared services. As one example of that, we are now providing—
My question was about the timeline. So what's the timeline? Do we have a timeline for complete? If you have none, then I can move on to my next question.
The timing is happening now, sir. We are actively moving agencies to more modern shared services, and that progression is going to occur throughout future fiscal years.
In the House, I passed legislation requiring DHS to adopt a software bill of materials, SBOM. Should there be an SBOM mandate to which every agency is subject? What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Goldstein?
Sir, at this point, there is urgent work to be done across the national and indeed global cybersecurity community to get to a point where we have an approach to software bill of materials that is automated and interoperable. That is work that CISA is helping to drive under the auspices of a broader effort focused on software security for the broader community. At this point, that foundational work is a prerequisite to a mandate being effective in achieving the change that we collectively want to advance.
My time has expired. So.
I think our vice chair for his questioning, and I want to use the chair's prerogative to circle back to Dr. Romine and Mr. Shive on a question I posed earlier, and it's about fully implementing the Executive Order 14028. And then we know that it will take time and resources, but with our adversaries constantly working to breach federal networks, it is essential that we make progress to shore up our defenses now. So my question to both of you, now that it's been a year since the executive order was signed, how are federal networks more secure today than they were 1 year ago? Dr. Romine?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. Nist is not an operational agency, and therefore we don't really have insight into the current stance of federal networks at other federal agencies, other than in conversations with our peers. But I will say this, that because the executive order shined a spotlight, a critical spotlight on this issue and provided a set of actionable things that could be taken, steps that could be taken, and because, as CISA pointed out, they have achieved all of their milestones in the first year. I'm happy to report that NIST achieved all of our milestones. I think we had a dozen of them in the first year as well. Some of those were interdependent. We worked collaboratively to make sure that those things happened. I'm confident that the hard work is now beginning on rolling out the effect of the executive order to the rest of the agencies, and the improvement will continue over the next year.
And Mr. Shive?
I can talk about the GSA experience. The ways that we're more secure now than we were a year ago are We now have the ability to assess endpoints with granular visibility. And that's not just laptops and servers. That's extensible out to cell phones and operational technology devices, otherwise known as the Internet of Things. We've expanded that ability to have granular visibility into the form, function, and action of those devices that we didn't have a year ago. We've increased our presence. We already had nearly ubiquitous multi-factor authentication running in the agency, but we've employed multi-factor authentication that has deep and meaningful user experience positive outcomes, so it's easier for our users to use that, so they're not inclined to try to find other ways to get into our systems. We have much deeper encryption throughout our enterprise. Everything out in the cloud, everything outside of the walls of GSA has been encrypted for years, but we've even encrypted most of our internal infrastructure. And most importantly, we have visibility about not only the user actions, but the system actions running across our networks. That visibility is giving us the ability to take a look at how well things are patched and updated, how well people are using systems, and we're giving people access to systems based on where they are at that moment and who they are and what they're trying to do in that moment. But also increasingly, we have the ability to extend that out to non-user-based devices, which represent a significant threat vector for nation-state adversaries.
Well, very well. I want to thank our witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members of the committee, of the subcommittee, for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for each witness, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the subcommittee record will remain open for 10 business days, and without objection, you're off the hot seat. The subcommittee stands adjourned.